goes right back to copper-based products for controlling the early fungicides, if you like. They go back to believe it or not, the 1800s. But I think the next step, if you like, from that was really from the 1950s, that kind of period onward, when we moved on to herbicides and that.
The sprayer is a vital piece of equipment for farmers. It's used to apply plant protection products, fertilizers and micronutrients. These applications must be carried out accurately, efficiently and without fuss. Despite advancements in technologies, the fundamental principles remain the same, delivering uniform droplets directly to the target area. You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. In this, the first of a two-part series, I'm joined by Dermot Forristal to discuss the developments in sprayer technologies and how it's influenced modern practices. I first asked Dermot how sprayers have jumped on in technology over the past 5 years.
The modern sprayer looks a lot different than the one in the past, and some of the technologies available are a lot different. Some of that is around, we can now have kind of variable rate spraying through either pulse width modulation nozzles or through automatic switching nozzles. So that's a big change. I suppose what's more, on the scene, if you like, but not fully there in many ways, is the ability for spot spraying or patch spraying using maybe sensors on the boom itself to try and recognize areas that would benefit from, getting a treatment, whether it's a herbicide or for weed control or a fungicide for disease control. So those are the two main kind of technology development areas. But the sheer size, scale, and control of sprayers has changed an awful lot as well.
An awful lot, yeah. So if we go back then, and we would go all the way back to maybe when sprayers became sort of more modern practice, and I don't know whether I'd be remembering right or wrong, but maybe I've seen stuff way back when there was a little sprayer hooked up to a horse-drawn type scenario, and I think there might have been spraying potatoes or something with a bit of bluestone or something like that. But when did sprayers become more common throughout the majority of farms in Ireland?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think the need to spray potatoes and in France the need to spray grapes. That's really
Sure.
what got sprayers started, and your horse-drawn equipment started from that basis. And they had the basics of what a sprayer has today. In other words, they had nozzles, if you like, they had a tank, they had a pump, and they had some sort of pressure regulation system. So you're right, Michael. It goes right back to copper-based products for controlling the early fungicides, if you like. They go back to believe it or not, the 1800s. But I think the next step, if you like, from that came, I suppose, really from the 1950s, that kind of period onward, when we moved on to herbicides and that.
And was it the herbicides were the first kind of thing out the door in terms of trying to control those weeds that were in lots of tillage ground?
Yeah, I think so. I think you're looking at quite a step change. Now, there were herbicides, I suppose, strong acids and various things like that, and maybe some products that people might hear more about again, if people are trying to go back to them. But I think the first herbicides really were the hormone type herbicides that were developed in the late 40s and the early 50s. And the ones that the first names, if you like, were 2,4-D and MCPA, those hormone type herbicides. And that kind of revolutionized things because it did give you the ability to control weeds, broad-leaved weeds, basically in cereals, and they are used to this day. And the amazing thing is that they are quite effective, and we are kind of turning back to some of those products to some extent to overcome some of the resistance issues with some of the others. So they're an amazing set of chemicals that have lasted from being developed in the 1940s right up to today. But yes, they then, sprayers began to get more common. Before, you might have had just a method of spraying a few drills of potatoes on a farm, but now you had a true herbicide that meant that there was huge benefit from spraying all of your cereals, and so the sprayers became more common.
And if you're to look at then, back in the, I don't know, 50s and maybe early 60s or maybe mid 60s, somewhere along there, what was regarded as, the best available technology in those days?
Yeah, look, the best technology was a very simple container, usually 3-point linkage mounted. The pump was a PTO pump like today, but in this case, usually slid directly onto the PTO shaft of the tractor. A very small boom, anything from 4 or 5 meters up to 6, 7, maybe 8 meters. Very simple cone nozzles, very simple on-off control. And I suppose, unfortunately, I suppose in terms of the techniques of filling in that, some operators got themselves probably exposed to products in ways that we wouldn't consider acceptable today as well. So it was a much simpler operation, but the basics were actually there in terms of the sprayer. Like at the end of the day, all the herbicide or all the weed knows or all the plant knows is that it's getting a certain product, whether that be herbicide or fungicide, sprayed onto it. So once you get the rate right, once you get the droplet spectrum size right and then the nozzle in the right place and so on, that's really all you need for it to be effective. But the way the sprayer does that, it does it much more efficiently today and much faster than you would have been capable of in the past.
I suppose when you talk about that, Dermot, I don't know which came first. Was it the much larger sprayers you mentioned, up to maybe a 6 meter boom, back in the day, but obviously they got bigger over time. But then tram lines became more widespread. At what stage or what time was that? Was it in the early 80s or was it even in the 70s? I can't
No,
remember.
it's probably the 70s, Michael, that tram
Okay.
lines came about, but certainly got very popular from the very beginning of the 80s. But no, I'd say mid 70s really. And there was work done in the UK and Ireland quite early on, actually, on tram lines. And the systems, as you say, at that time were all based on effectively 2.4 meter drills, 8 foot wide drills. They were modified to give it true 2.4 meters, if you like, and then 5 runs of that drill became your 12 meters. So the boom got a bit wider. The fertilizer spreader did get wider at that stage. So it quickly became that 12 meter became the first standard, if you like. So that changed things. It meant that the sprayers and spreaders could get big, could reliably work in the field without overlapping incorrectly. And like it was extremely important from that perspective because I remember well, people spraying in crops. Like it's one thing going on grassland, but you'd see these wavy lines up and down crops where people had no real guidance, just basic markers maybe put out in the field, or a young fella, maybe you were one of those young fellas, Michael,
I was
standing
one of
out in
those
the
young
field
fellas. Yep, I was.
trying to mark where it was. So yeah, tram lines were transformative.
Okay, so they must have helped a lot. Just thinking back in the day again, to when I was a young fella, there was a good bit of band spraying going on, and I kind of sort of think that they were maybe ahead of their time in the extent that we might be looking back towards that part again with some of that herbicide resistances out there.
Yeah, oh, I think you're 100% correct. Yeah, the system in the past was with any row crops like sugar beet or whatever, we had band spraying systems which aimed to use your selective weed killer right on the row of the row crop, right on the row of beet, and then the area between the rows you largely relied on mechanical cultivation to actually control your weeds. And this is a system that's been looked at again. In other words, because of resistance issues and so on with herbicides, less registration of herbicides, people are looking towards cultural weed control methods and, mechanical weed control within the crop. So, again, it's based mainly, I suppose, on crops that are sown in rows, but people are considering going back towards cereals even. Can we have a row structure in cereals that will suit mechanical weeding? I saw at Agritech, the last Agritechnica show, one of the manufacturers showing a system for working within 125 millimeter rows. That's the row spacing of cereals. Now, I think that would be a big ask, but certainly you could go to up to 200 millimeter maybe spacing without too much yield loss to accommodate mechanical weed control. But as you started there, Michael, that's a big ask. But as you started, certainly if you go to traditional row crops, though, in other words, beet type crops, maize, things like that, a return towards band spraying to reduce the amount of herbicide used and then mechanical in between rows, that's possible.
Moving then back towards the kind of the larger machines, and there's some very large machines out there at the moment, fully self-propelled. I don't know what some of them have in 6 or 8 thousand liter kind of tanks. You're getting into very high capacity sprayers. Apart from getting over the ground really, really fast, what are the other advantages of those really large sprayers?
Yeah, well, most of the advantage is in terms of capacity. There was absolutely no doubt about that. It is tank size, matched often with a very big boom. You see booms like could be up to 42 meters or something like that. But I don't think there's any in Ireland, maybe past 36 at the moment. But certainly, people have kind of moved from the standard 24 up, 27, 28, 30, 32, up to 36 meters. But most of the advantage is in capacity. They're big tanks. They're particularly useful if you do need high volume applications. So people with potato crops will tend to be using bigger water volumes, whereas some of the cereal growers would have reduced their water volume. So the tank capacity is a bigger benefit in that situation. Self-propelled versus trailed, I suppose where the self-propelled has a real advantage is if you need height and you need clearance beneath it. You can design the self-propelled sprayer with that height. Some of them even have adjustable height. You'd see ones that you could walk on. Well, I'm not so sure about you, Michael, but I could walk under one of them, depending on your height. So that's the advantage there, because actually trail sprayers can have a bigger capacity. You can buy trail sprayers, believe it or not, with a capacity of up to 11,000 liters or something like that, whereas your self-propelled would be nearer half that. So that's at the limit. So, but it is mainly down to work rate.
Okay, but obviously there's some downsides then to having such a large tank. It's one fill for a big area, and there's not a huge capacity, I suppose, to spot spray or stuff with those, is there?
Well, the spot spraying comes down to, if you are using a spot spraying system, it's usually an auxiliary system that's on your sprayer that will dose in maybe that extra product. So I think the spot spraying technology could still be used with those. But I think the downside to such large tanks, is the initial purchase cost, of course. Um, the compaction impact maybe as well, and particularly towards headlands and stuff like that, trying to have tires big enough to carry those and not be taking out too much crop. So there are compromises. There's no doubt about that. And cost is a big one. But on the positive side to cost, if you want to bring a new technology though, like, and we'll probably get to it, but say auto switching of nozzles and stuff like that, if you're doing it on a big high capacity sprayer, that technology then is going to be used over a big area. So it does save a little bit in terms of adopting the latest technology. But the overall cost of those systems, look, you have to have the scale to justify them.
As you mentioned the technology, describe that, the auto switching of the nozzles.
Yeah, well, this is down to, really, I suppose, two things or two uses. If we want to vary how much we're putting out, in other words, if we do get to a point in the future, and we're not quite there yet, where we want to put more chemical on particular parts of the field or something like that, how do you actually go about doing it? Like with an ordinary sprayer, you have relatively limited capacity. In other words, if you're working with a certain size of nozzle, unless you're going to change your forward speed a lot, and that'll affect the whole boom, if you know what I mean. So it'll affect everything. Unless you're going to change your forward speed, you can't actually vary it too much. If you change pressure, you're going to change spray quality, and you haven't got that much range. So one of the options is at each nozzle spacing point. So your nozzles are normally at 50 centimeter spacings. Now they can be half that, but normally at 50 centimeters. So at each nozzle spacing point, you may have 3 or 4 nozzles. Now, most farmers say, "Oh, I have that already," but they're manually switched. In other words, you decide, I'm working this nozzle for this field today, and you change to another one. But if you had those all pointing downwards into the crop, but electronically controlled, then
Hmm.
you can, with your control system, mix and match the nozzle size to suit the particular application. In other words, as you're traveling along and you see an area that needs more, and it doesn't even have to be the width of a boom, you could control that part of the boom. You could decide, I want to up the rate of the chemical here. So it literally changes the nozzle that's been used. So instead of being spraying with a blue nozzle, it goes to a red. Or if it wants to put even more, it could combine the blue and red together. So that gives us the potential to do that. The other benefit from that is actually on headlands. Think, Michael, about these big wide booms, 24 meters and bigger, going around a curved headland, right? There's a huge difference in the application rate when you're turning that sprayer. If you're going around a gentle curve, with the outer part of the boom might be going very, very fast. The actual tip speed at the end of the boom is very, very fast. The inner part changing that one part is getting way more chemical than the other, unintentionally so, because of the boom movement. So these systems, if they are fitted to the sprayers, they'll automatically control that by switching on and off nozzles at the individual points to correct for that. So that's one of that. There's another way of doing it, and that's pulse width modulation. But the technology I'm talking about is having multiple nozzles switchable at an individual point on the boom.
So that's it for this week, and thanks to Dermot for joining me on the podcast. We will continue this conversation with Dermot in a few weeks, so please join us then. So as usual, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague, and as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.